After being expelled from Eden, Adam and Eve face a stark new reality. Without the privileges of the perfect garden, every step is now a struggle for survival. Yet, amid the hard work and the pains of existence, they face something even more challenging, the guilt and longing for God. As they strive to build a new life, secrets from the past haunt them, and valuable lessons begin to emerge. However, when a new kind of evil arises to test their faith, the true battle for redemption begins. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stick with us until the end, because this story might be more surprising than you think. The first night outside Eden. The sky darkened, unveiling a vast expanse of stars Adam and Eve had never noticed before. In Eden, the light of God's presence filled everything. Now, the world seemed immense, empty, and eerily silent. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant howl of an animal, made their hearts race. They were alone. Eve clung tightly to Adam's arm as they walked over rough terrain. Their feet, once accustomed to the soft grass of Eden, now encountered sharp stones and thorns that cut and bruised them. They felt the weight of exhaustion, a sensation entirely new to them. "Adam, where are we going?" Her voice trembled. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the dark horizon, searching for something, anything, that might guide them. "I don't know, Eve. But we must keep moving." He gripped her hand firmly. "God hasn't abandoned us completely. He gave us clothes. He'll show us the way." The garments of skin God had made to cover them protected their bodies, but they could not warm their wounded souls. It was impossible not to think of the garden, of the peace they had before their fateful mistake. Eve bit her lip to hold back tears as the memory of the serpent hissing in her ear haunted her. When they finally stopped to rest, Adam gathered dry branches and clumsily attempted to start a fire. He failed repeatedly, rubbing stones and wood together until his hands were raw. Eve watched, hugging her knees, as the darkness around them seemed to close in like a heavy shroud. "Adam, maybe we should pray," she suggested hesitantly. Her words were met with a frustrated sigh. "Pray? And say what? Ask to go back? He won't let us, Eve." His tone was bitter, but he quickly realized how much his words had hurt her. He took a deep breath and lowered his head. "I'm sorry. Let's pray." Kneeling together on the hard ground, their hands clasped, they struggled to put their pain into words. They could only weep silently, their tears mixing with the dust beneath them. That night, as they finally drifted off to sleep in the cold, Eve had a dream. She saw Eden in the distance, glowing like gold. A gentle but firm voice whispered, "What was taken cannot be returned, but a new path will be revealed." Eve woke with a start, her heart racing. She looked at Adam, still asleep, and then at the sky, now beginning to brighten with the first rays of dawn. Deep inside, she knew this was just the beginning, and the road ahead would be more difficult than they could ever imagine. Eve chose not to share her dream with Adam, but the words echoed in her mind. What path lay ahead? And would they be ready to face it? The weight of guilt. The sun rose timidly, casting golden rays over the rugged terrain. Adam awoke to the sound of unfamiliar birds. The scent of Eden still lingered in his memory, but as he opened his eyes and saw the dry, stony ground, reality hit him hard. Eve was already up, staring into the distant horizon. Her gaze was fixed, her expression a mix of pain and determination. "You didn't sleep well," Adam said, walking toward her. Eve didn't respond immediately, as though searching for the right words. "I had a dream," she finally admitted, hesitating. A voice told me that what was taken cannot be returned, but a new path will be revealed. Adam frowned, pondering the meaning of her words. A new path? He couldn't fathom anything that could restore what they had lost. Every breath, every step away from Eden seemed to deepen the weight they carried. Whatever that path is, we can't stay here, he said, trying to push away the helplessness that gnawed at him. We need to find water, food, something to sustain us. As they traversed the desolate land, their conversation was sparse. The silence was filled with bitter thoughts. For Adam, guilt clung to him like a persistent shadow. He should have protected Eve, should have refused the fruit, should have done something different. Adam, Eve began, breaking the silence. Do you think he'll ever forgive us? The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Adam stopped walking and turned to face her. Eve's eyes were glistening, filled with a vulnerability he had never seen before. He wanted to comfort her, but he didn't know how. His own pain ran just as deep. I don't know, Eve, he admitted, his voice heavy with sorrow. But I hope so. He gave us clothes. That must mean something, right? Eve nodded slowly, but the comfort offered by those words was minimal. The garments were a constant reminder of their shame, not a promise of forgiveness. Every detail seemed to conspire to ensure they never forgot what they had done. Later, while searching for food, Adam knelt beside a small stream they discovered. He splashed water on his face and stared at his reflection. His face looked older, harder. The joy he once knew was gone. Do you think our children will blame us someday? Adam asked suddenly, not looking at Eve. The thought struck him like lightning as he stared into his reflection. Eve, gathering wild berries nearby, paused. The idea had never crossed her mind before, but now she couldn't shake it. Their children. One day, they would learn of Eden, of what their parents had lost. Maybe, she said softly. But we must teach them. Show them that even far from Eden, God is still God. He still loves us. That will have to be enough, Adam. It has to be. Eve knelt beside him and touched his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried profound meaning. Her touch reminded him that despite everything, they still had each other. That was something Eden couldn't take away. In the silence that followed, a strange sound echoed in the distance. It was unlike anything they had ever heard before, a low, menacing growl. They weren't as alone as they thought. The first cultivation. The distant growl made Adam and Eve's hearts race, but they didn't dare stop. They moved on in silence, every step taken with caution. Though the threat was unknown, instinct told them they needed to find shelter before nightfall. The realization that the world was now a hostile place weighed heavily on them both. After hours of walking, they reached a small valley where the soil seemed richer. A stream meandered through the rocks, feeding a few trees and shrubs. The landscape was less forbidding, and Adam decided this would be the place where they would begin anew. If we're going to survive, we need to work the land, he declared, picking up a sturdy branch to use as an improvised tool. It was a crude attempt to till the earth, a stark contrast to Eden, where everything had effortlessly flourished. Eve watched, still holding the fruits she had gathered. Adam's determination was evident, but his movements were clumsy, and the branch broke easily against the hardened soil. Sweat dripped down his face as he stubbornly pressed on. "Let me help," she said, stepping forward. Picking up another branch, she began digging beside him. With every attempt, their arms ached, and frustration mounted. The ground seemed to resist, unwilling to yield. It shouldn't be like this, Adam muttered, throwing the branch to the ground in frustration. The earth was supposed to nourish us, not fight against us. Eve placed a hand on his shoulder. Adam, mourning what should have been won't help us. We have to accept what is. He looked at her, seeing the resolve in her eyes. It reminded him that despite the hardships, they still had each other. Drawing strength from her determination, he picked up the branch again and resumed his labor. The following days were marked by trial and error. Adam learned to identify plants that could be useful and those that were poisonous. Eve experimented with ways to prepare the fruits and roots they gathered, trying to make them more palatable. Their hands grew calloused, and their bodies slowly adjusted to the grueling work. Adam, look at this, Eve called one afternoon, holding up a small plant sprouting where they had scattered seeds. It was a sign they were on the right path. Adam knelt beside her, studying the tiny sprout. He couldn't help but smile faintly. This is something we did, Eve. Something good. But even in that moment of joy, the memory of Eden lingered like a shadow. They both knew that this small plant was a faint echo of the abundance they had once known. And yet, it was the start of something new. The gift of new life. As the weeks passed, the small garden they had begun to cultivate started to thrive, and life, though challenging, carried on. Adam and Eve had learned to better defend themselves, to find resources, and to work together in a world that often felt like it was conspiring against them. But one day, Eve began to notice something different. Her body was changing, and a new life was growing within her. Adam, she called one morning as he worked by the stream. Her voice was soft, but it carried a note of surprise and wonder. Adam looked up. What is it, Eve? Approaching her, he noticed her hand resting gently on her abdomen. For a moment, he didn't understand. Then he saw the tears welling in her eyes. There's a child, she said, her voice trembling with a shy smile. Adam, I'm carrying a child. The news struck him like lightning, leaving him momentarily speechless. A child. A new life. It was a mixture of joy and apprehension. How could they raise a child in this harsh world? How could they protect it from the evil that now permeated the earth? This is a gift from God, he said finally, his voice filled with reverence. Despite everything, he has blessed us with this. Eve smiled, though deep inside, she understood that this child would not only be a blessing but also a test of their faith and resilience. They would need to be stronger than ever. Months passed, and Eve faced the challenges of pregnancy with courage, though not without struggle. The daily toil became more burdensome, and Adam took on much of the work to ease her load. At night, they would sit together and dream about their child's future. Do you think he'll have the chance to know God as we did? Eve asked one evening, her head resting on Adam's shoulder. I hope so, Adam replied. And we'll do everything we can to teach him to walk in his ways. When the day of the birth arrived, it was a painful and frightening experience. Eve had never known such intense pain, and Adam stayed by her side, gripping her hand tightly. For hours she labored until, at last, the sound of the first cry echoed through the valley. It was a boy. Cain, Eve whispered, cradling the newborn in her arms. His name will be Cain. Adam gazed at his son with a mix of awe and gratitude. In this tiny life, he saw a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of a new story for them. But as Adam and Eve admired the baby, a cold wind swept through the valley, carrying an uneasy sense of foreboding. It seemed to whisper that this new life would bring with it new challenges, challenges that could shake the very foundation of their faith and resolve. The birth of Cain. The days following Cain's birth were filled with quiet joy but also profound uncertainty. Adam and Eve felt blessed by their son's life, yet the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on them. Cain, with his tiny cries and curious eyes, was proof that life continued even outside Eden. Eve cradled the baby tenderly, rocking him as Adam watched. "He's so small," she said, gazing at Cain's rosy, peaceful face. "How can we protect him from such a cruel world?" "With God," Adam replied, though his voice carried a hint of doubt. He was still grappling with how God's presence would manifest now, distant as it seemed. "We must teach Cain what we know about him. Teach him that, even here, God is merciful." Eve nodded, though fear lingered in her heart. That night, as she nursed Cain, she remembered God's promise that the woman's seed would crush the serpent's head. Could Cain be part of that promise? The thought gave her hope but also a profound sense of responsibility. Cain's first months were challenging. Adam worked tirelessly to cultivate the land, while Eve cared for Cain and contributed to the family's survival. Every small success felt like a miracle, a ripe fruit, a patch of fertile ground, or even Cain's laughter at the sound of his father's voice. "He's strong," Adam remarked one afternoon as Cain played with a stone. "Maybe that's his purpose. To be strong enough to face this world." Eve, sitting by a makeshift fire, smiled as she watched her son. "Cain is a gift, Adam. I feel it in my heart. But sometimes, I wonder what it would have been like to raise him in Eden, where there was no pain, no fear." Adam sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. "Eve, we can't live in the world of what could have been. We must focus on what is." His words were wise, but they didn't erase Eve's worries. She knew that outside Eden, every choice, every action bore far greater consequences. By the time Cain turned 1, life had settled into a fragile rhythm. Their small garden thrived, and Adam had built a rudimentary shelter to protect the family from the dangers of the night. Eve began teaching Cain about the wonders of the Creator. Pointing to the starry sky, she would say, "God made all of this, Cain. And one day, if you follow him, you may come to know him as we did." But the innocence of their little family was interrupted when Eve started to feel the same signs she had felt before. She was pregnant again. The news brought mixed emotions. Adam was pleased but anxious. How would they care for 2 children in such a harsh world? "God will provide," Eve said with conviction, though deep down, she feared what lay ahead. Months later, the birth of Abel brought renewed joy to the family. Eve felt that God was giving them a second chance. Cain and Abel grew up together, exploring the small valley and playing near the garden. But from an early age, Adam and Eve noticed differences between their sons. Cain was intense and determined, while Abel was calm and contemplative. One night, as the boys slept, Eve lay beside Adam. "Do you think Cain knows he's the firstborn?" she asked. "That he has a special responsibility?" Adam pondered her question before answering. "I think he feels it. But we need to be careful. Responsibility can easily turn into pride. Subtle envy." Cain grew quickly, with a determination and strength that impressed Adam and Eve. He worked alongside his father in the fields, learning to tame the harsh soil and coax sustenance from it to support the family. Meanwhile, Abel, younger and calmer in temperament, spent his days tending to the small flock of animals they had managed to raise. The division of labor felt natural, but the differences between the brothers soon became strikingly apparent. "Cain is so focused, so intense," Eve remarked to Adam one evening as they watched their sons playing in the distance. But sometimes, I feel like there's something inside him, burning, as if he's never truly satisfied. Adam considered her words before responding. He has a strong spirit, Eve. That can be either a blessing or a curse, depending on how he uses it. We need to guide him carefully. As they grew, Cain and Abel's personalities and interests became even more distinct. Cain was diligent but often impatient, his intensity bordering on restlessness. Abel, in contrast, seemed to possess a quiet reverence for the world around him, particularly the animals he cared for, a quality that often irritated his older brother. "Why do you spend so much time with those sheep?" Cain scoffed one day, casting a disdainful glance as Abel gently stroked one of the animals. "They don't do any work. All they do is eat and sleep." Abel looked up, unbothered by the remark. "They are part of God's creation, Cain. Caring for them is a privilege." Cain snorted and walked away, muttering about the uselessness of Abel's work. Though he wouldn't admit it, something about his brother's calm demeanor and connection to God gnawed at him. It was as if Abel had access to something Cain himself could not grasp. As the years passed, Adam taught his sons the importance of offering sacrifices to God. He explained that even outside Eden, gratitude and obedience were vital to maintaining a relationship with the Creator. The day came when Cain and Abel were to present their own offerings. Cain brought the fruits of his labor, grains and vegetables he had worked hard to grow. He laid them carefully on the makeshift altar, proud of his harvest. Abel, on the other hand, brought the best of his flock, a spotless lamb. His offering was made with humility, an act of complete submission to God. From a distance, Adam and Eve watched in silence as the brothers made their offerings. Then, something extraordinary happened. God's favor visibly rested on Abel's sacrifice. The flames consuming his offering burned brightly, with a fervor that seemed almost alive. Cain's offering, however, smoldered faintly, ordinary and lifeless by comparison. "Why?" Cain demanded, his voice trembling with anger as his fists clenched. Why was his sacrifice accepted and mine wasn't? Mine was just as good. Adam tried to calm him. "It's not about the quality of the offering, Cain. It's about the heart behind it. Perhaps you need to approach God with more humility." Those words cut Cain deeper than he cared to admit. He turned his gaze to Abel, who remained silent, and felt something dark and unfamiliar stir within him. Every triumph of his brothers felt like a glaring reminder of his own inadequacies. In the weeks that followed, the distance between the brothers grew. Cain threw himself into his work in the fields, driven by a need to prove himself, to God, to his family, and perhaps most of all, to himself. Abel, on the other hand, continued tending his flock with the same quiet devotion that had always defined him. "He thinks he's better than me," Cain muttered under his breath, his hands gripping the soil as he worked. "But I work harder. I fight more. Why does he get God's favor?" Eve, observing from a distance, noticed the change in her eldest son. She approached him, her voice gentle. "Cain, your heart seems troubled. Talk to me. What's bothering you?" He avoided her gaze, his jaw tightening. "Nothing, Mother. Just let me work." But Eve knew better. The look in Cain's eyes was different now, darker, and filled with a resentment she couldn't fully understand but knew was dangerous. That night, as the rest of the family slept, Cain lay awake under the starry sky. The same sky that Eve had often pointed to as evidence of God's presence now seemed cold and distant. A thought began to take shape in his mind, one he didn't know if he had the courage to act upon but that had already begun to consume him. The rejected sacrifice. The days dragged on, but Cain's resentment grew steadily, like a shadow that darkened everything around him. He avoided Abel, speaking to him only when necessary. Adam and Eve noticed the rift between their sons but felt helpless to bridge it. The tension in their small family was palpable, every silence heavier than the last. Cain spent more and more time in the fields, working with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He pushed the plow forcefully, as though physical exertion could drown out the voice in his mind that echoed relentlessly, "I wasn't accepted." He was. Why? Meanwhile, Abel remained serene. He continued tending his flock, often singing praises to the Lord as he worked. His calm presence only fueled Cain's frustration. To the older brother, Abel's humility seemed like veiled arrogance. One afternoon, while working alone in the fields, Cain heard footsteps behind him. Turning quickly, he saw Abel approaching, carrying a bowl of fruit and water. "You've been working hard, Cain," Abel said with a gentle smile. "I thought you might be hungry." Cain hesitated, his eyes fixed on the offering. Part of him wanted to accept, but another part, a darker, angrier part, held him back. He shook his head. "I don't need your help, Abel. I'm fine." Abel set the bowl on the ground without argument. "If you change your mind, it's here. Don't forget, Cain, we're brothers." "That will never change." Those words, spoken so calmly, only deepened Cain's fury. Abel turned to leave, but Cain's gaze followed him, burning with resentment as his brother disappeared among the trees. That evening, as Adam and Eve spoke by the fire, Cain sat apart, staring into the glowing embers. His thoughts were clouded, and he barely noticed when his father approached. "Cain," Adam began, sitting beside him. "I can see the burden in your heart. Envy is a dangerous trap. I know you feel that God has rejected you, but that's not true. He wants your best, Cain. He wants your heart." Adam's words only added fuel to Cain's internal fire. He looked up, his fists clenched. "And Abel's heart is better than mine? Is that what you're saying?" Adam sighed deeply, placing a hand on Cain's shoulder. "No, my son. I'm saying that God knows us better than we know ourselves. Perhaps He's calling you to grow, to learn something you don't yet understand." Cain didn't reply, but his eyes glistened with a mix of anger and hurt. Rising abruptly, he walked away into the night, leaving Adam behind. As he wandered alone, a voice spoke to Cain, not his father's, but something darker, more insidious. The voice seemed to come from within, yet it was unmistakably separate. "Why do you suffer, Cain? Why let him be the favorite? You work harder. You deserve more. Yet you're treated as nothing." Cain froze, his eyes wide. The voice continued, slithering through his thoughts like the serpent had once done to Eve. "There's a solution. Remove him. Just once. And then, you will be the only one." The idea horrified him, but it also intrigued him. He tried to shake the thoughts away, but the voice lingered, echoing in his mind as he made his way back home. The next morning, Abel approached Cain again, unaware of the storm brewing within his brother. "Let's go to the fields," Cain suggested, forcing a smile. "I want to show you something." Abel, trusting and unaware, agreed. As they walked through the fields, Cain's heart pounded. The voice in his mind was louder now, urging him forward. When they reached an isolated spot, far from Adam and Eve's sight, Cain stopped. "This is a good place," he said, picking up a stone from the ground. Abel frowned, puzzled. "What do you want to show me, brother?" Abel asked, his tone kind. For a moment, Cain hesitated. The struggle within him was visible on his face. But then, in a burst of rage, he lifted the stone. The last thing Abel saw was the pain and hatred in his brother's eyes. When silence returned to the field, Cain fell to his knees, his hands stained with Abel's blood. The voice in his mind was gone, replaced by a deafening void. Slowly, the weight of what he had done began to descend on him, carrying with it a terrible new reality, one he could never escape. The first sin outside Eden. The field was silent, the air heavy as if the earth itself mourned. Cain stared at his trembling hands, now stained with Abel's blood. The stone he had used fell from his grasp with a dull thud, but the guilt pounding in his chest was deafening. He sank to his knees beside his brother's lifeless body, his gaze fixed on Abel's peaceful face. Abel hadn't fought, hadn't resisted. Yet, Cain felt as if his brother's calm gaze still judged him, even in death. I didn't mean to," he murmured, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. He knew they were a lie. He had meant to. He had acted. And now there was no turning back. Far away, Adam and Eve worked together, unaware of the horror that had unfolded. Eva, however, felt a strange unease in her chest but brushed it off, attributing it to exhaustion. "Do you think our sons are happy, Adam?" she asked, wiping sweat from her brow. Adam paused, reflecting. "I think they're learning to live in this world. It's not easy, but I believe they know, deep down, that we're still a family." Eve smiled faintly, but the unease lingered. Cain wandered aimlessly, weighed down by the enormity of his act. Each step felt heavier, as if the earth itself resisted his presence. Finally, he collapsed, burying his face in his hands. Then, he heard a voice, not the dark, tempting whisper that had led him to this point, but something infinitely greater. A voice firm, commanding, and full of authority. "Cain, where is Abel, your brother?" Cain froze, his blood turning cold. He recognized the voice of God, unmistakable and penetrating to the depths of his soul. He couldn't bear to lift his eyes but forced himself to reply. "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" The silence that followed was unbearable, the weight of God's gaze pressing upon him. Then came the accusation, sharp and undeniable. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Cain's composure shattered. He began to sob, the guilt and shame consuming him entirely. Before God pronounced it, Cain already knew his punishment. "Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." The words struck Cain like thunder, reverberating in his soul. The punishment was not just physical exile but a profound spiritual separation from God. Desperate, he pleaded, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Anyone who finds me will kill me." But even in judgment, God showed mercy. Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance sevenfold. Then God placed a mark on Cain, a sign of protection to deter anyone from harming him. The mark was a constant reminder of his guilt and separation, but also of God's enduring mercy. When Cain returned home, the sky was already darkening. He didn't bring Abel's body, the thought of facing Adam and Eve was unbearable. As he stepped into the shelter, Eva was waiting. "Cain, where is your brother?" she asked softly, though something in her eyes suggested she already feared the answer. Cain averted his gaze and said nothing. He quickly left, disappearing into the shadows. Eva stood frozen, her heart sinking. "Adam," she called, her voice trembling. "Something is wrong. Abel hasn't returned." Adam hurried to join her, following her gaze toward the fields. Together, they walked to the place where their sons often worked. What they found shattered them: Abel's body, bloodied and lifeless, lying on the ground. Eva collapsed to her knees, a wail escaping her lips that seemed to tear through the heavens. "My son! My Abel!" Adam, in shock, knelt beside her, trying to comfort her, though he was equally broken. When they returned home, Cain's absence confirmed their worst fears. He was responsible. "How could this happen, Adam?" Eva wept. "How could our son? How could he do this?" Adam shook his head, his face etched with sorrow. "Sin follows us, Eva. What began in Eden has spread, and now it has claimed our children." As Cain fled, he glanced at the stars one last time before vanishing into the darkness. Meanwhile, Eva, her heart heavy with grief, clung to a single question: could there still be hope for their family after so much loss? In her deepest pain, she prayed for a sign, anything to show that God had not abandoned them, even in the shadow of death. A new beginning in Seth. The days following the tragedy were dark for Adam and Eve. Their small home felt unbearably empty, and the silence of the fields was a constant reminder of Abel's absence and Cain's betrayal. Eve spent hours by the grave where they had buried Abel, crying softly, while Adam toiled in the fields, trying to dull his pain through hard work. "Eve," he said one evening, sitting beside her by the fire, "we can't go on like this. We must trust that God still has a plan for us." Eve wiped her tears and looked up at the stars, shining indifferently in the sky. "I trusted, Adam. And I lost a son. The other, it's as if he's lost too. Does God still hear us?" Adam held her hands firmly. "He hears us, Eve. He promised that the seed would come through our line. We must believe that, even in our pain." A few months later, Eve noticed changes in her body. The weight of her grief was momentarily replaced by a mix of surprise and hope. She was pregnant again. When she told Adam, he embraced her tightly. "This is a sign from God," he said. "A new chance." But Eve couldn't shake her fear. What if this child turns out like Cain? What if the pain returns? "God has given us another opportunity," Adam reassured her. "We will raise this child to know him and follow him." The months that followed brought a new kind of light to their home. Eve busied herself preparing for the baby's arrival, while Adam worked tirelessly to protect her and ensure they had enough food. Despite their struggles, the movement within Eve gave her hope. Perhaps this child would mark the beginning of something new, something good. Finally, the day came. Through pain and effort, Eve brought a baby boy into the world. When she held him in her arms for the first time, tears streamed down her face. He was healthy, and there was something peaceful about his expression that reminded her of Abel. "His name will be Seth," Eve said, her voice trembling. "For God has granted me another seed in place of Abel, whom Cain killed." Adam smiled and touched the baby's forehead. Seth. A name for a new beginning. As Seth grew, he displayed a balanced temperament, a mix of curiosity and wisdom that brought comfort to his parents. Adam spent hours teaching him about God, sharing stories of Eden, of how everything began, and how it was lost. "You carry a responsibility, my son," Adam said one evening as they gazed at the stars. Even far from Eden, even in the midst of sin, we are called to trust God and obey Him. Seth listened intently, taking his father's words to heart. He could see the sadness in Adam's eyes when he spoke of Cain and Abel, and it inspired him to honor his parents and God with his life. In time, Seth had children of his own, and his lineage began to grow. He passed down the same principles he had learned, emphasizing the importance of walking with God. It was during this time that the family began to regularly call upon the name of the Lord in worship. Eve, now older, watched from a distance as her grandchildren played. "Adam," she said one day as they sat together, "perhaps this is the redemption God promised. Not the end of pain, but a new beginning." Adam looked at her with a smile. "Do you think it's a coincidence that he gave us Seth? He is the start of something greater than us, Eve." Yet even as Adam and Eve found solace in Seth's lineage, the memory of Cain lingered. Where was he now? And what did the future hold for humanity, with sin rooted so deeply? Their descendants' journey would mirror their own, a struggle between God's grace and the consequences of human choices. The legacy of faith. Adam and Eve, now aged, lived surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The lineage of Seth had grown and prospered, spreading across the land. Despite the hardships of life outside Eden, there was a spirit of unity and reverence for God that filled their days with a gentle light, a glimmer of the promise yet to be fulfilled. One morning, Adam called Seth to walk with him. They strolled through the fields, just as they had when Seth was a child. Seth, now a grown man and a father himself, sensed that this conversation was significant. "Seth, my time here is drawing to a close," Adam began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I want you and your lineage to never forget what I have learned. Sin drove us away from God, but He has not given up on us. He promised that one day, a seed will come to crush evil forever." Seth nodded, his eyes filled with respect and reverence. "We will remember, Father. We will continue to call on the name of the Lord and teach it to our children." Adam placed a hand on Seth's shoulder, his face breaking into a proud smile. "You are a man of God, Seth. I trust you to carry forward what I began, even through mistakes and pain." After Adam's death, Eve lived a few more years, dedicating herself to teaching the younger generations about God's goodness, even amid the brokenness of the world. When her time came, she passed with a peaceful heart, confident that her family's purpose extended beyond her lifetime. The legacy of Seth. Seth's descendants thrived, and among them was Enosh, who led a renewal of fervent worship. He called upon the name of the Lord with deep devotion, establishing a legacy of faith that continued through the generations. The faith that began with Adam and Eve's hope carried on through Seth's lineage, passed from parent to child. Even as the world outside Eden remained harsh and challenging, the seed of faith endured, kept alive by those who trusted in the promise of redemption. Though Adam and Eve did not live to see the full unfolding of God's promise, they believed with all their hearts that one day redemption would come. The struggle between good and evil would persist, but the ultimate victory was assured. Yet, as Seth's lineage flourished, the line of Cain went its own way, moving farther and farther from God. The earth, scarred by sin, awaited redemption with longing, while the heavens remained silent, for now. The story of Adam and Eve reminds us that even in the face of the harshest consequences, hope is never completely lost. And you, how would you have responded in their place? What lessons can we learn about faith, forgiveness, and perseverance in the midst of adversity? Share in the comments how this story touched your heart and which part resonated with you the most. Let's reflect together on the greater purpose God has for each of us. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that inspire and strengthen faith. This is the Embracing Narratives channel. Stay with God, and see you in the next story.